So we've been talking a bit about energy, transformation of energy, reactions that are uphill reactions, meaning endergonic reactions. It's like pushing a car up a hill. It requires an input of energy. We talked about exergonic reactions, which are spontaneous. They're downhill reactions, like a car rolling down a hill. You don't have to put in energy. But how does this relate to our bodies? Well, one of the main molecules that is powering our reactions is ATP. ATP is known as adenosine triphosphate, and adenosine, as you might recall, is the A of the nucleotide A in DNA. And I just want to show you the basic structure of ATP. You can draw this yourself. It's pretty simple. We're gonna cartoon it basically. ATP has a 5-phosphate sugar. Now it has an OH there, so a little more like RNA perhaps, right? And it's going to have adenosine over here, right? I'm not going to draw the molecule. And then it has here a phosphate group, another phosphate group, and another phosphate group, all of them having negative charges, okay? So it's a nucleotide, it has a triphosphate group, and they're negatively charged, meaning they're pushing against each other, just like negative sides of a magnet. And so these covalent bonds are in tension with that push, and eventually at least this one will break off. If you have only if you break off one of these, ATP becomes ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and if you only have one phosphate group, they call it AMP, adenosine monophosphate. Okay, so if you ever see those words, that di or mono or tri lets you know how many phosphate groups are attached. When broken, every mole of ATP releases 7.3 kilocalories. Okay, so 7.3 kilocalories per mole. If you need to refresh your memory on what a calorie is, you can step back and review chapter 2 and 3. There'll be some information in there. But a kilocalorie is 1,000 calories. And that's when I say a kilocalorie is 1,000 calories. And oddly enough, a kilocalorie is actually a food calorie. That's what they call a calorie on a food label. We'll talk a little more about calories in a future chapter, but I just want to point that out. You should be familiar with those terms already. If you don't, please just look them up so some of this terminology makes a little more sense to you. Okay, so here is adenosine triphosphate. So you can see it has ribose as a sugar. There's an OH there. There are 3 phosphate groups attached here, and there's adenosine, which is a purine. They often call it an energy shuttle because we build this and then we can move it around. This is basically the battery of the cell. This is how cells power all most of the reactions. When this phosphate group breaks off and this becomes ADP, when that bond is broken, electrons move around and energy is released, and that energy does work in the cell. It does work, and of course some of it is lost as heat as well. But the breaking of that bond, that phosphate bond, that release of energy that takes place when that bond is broken, is where the energy that drives life is. That's what keeps you alive. That's what lets you think, feel, breathe, etc. Now, most cellular work is powered by the hydrolysis of ATP. Hydrolysis means to break. Lyse means to break. Hydrolysis. And what we can do in the body is we can use this exergonic reaction. The breaking of ATP is exergonic, right? That releases energy. But it can be used to fuel endergonic reactions. All right? So the breaking of ATP fuels other reactions. But overall, this is something to wrap your head around. Overall, this is called a coupled reaction, when one reaction fuels another. But if you take the whole thing into account, overall, even if it looks like an endergonic reaction, overall it's exergonic. Here, for example, we have food. This is energy from food. It's used to glue this phosphate to ADP. That makes ATP. ATP plus water yields ADP again. It's hydrolysis. It breaks apart and energy is released. And then this energy can be used to fuel other processes, right? So then you have ADP and phosphate again. More food energy comes in. You glue it back together again, back to ATP, and around we go. This is the cycle of ATP. This is why you eat food, other than for building blocks for your making your body. This is why you eat food, to fuel this reaction. Now, coupled reactions, once again, are when one reaction drives another. So here's an example of one. Here's glucose. And when we break down glucose, one of the first things we do is we stick a phosphate group to it. This I, by the way, stands for inorganic, meaning it's just a phosphate group on its own. There's no carbons on it or anything. All right, so this glucose is going to have a phosphate group glued to it. And when you do that, that actually adds in energy, partially because of that negative charge on that phosphate group. So when you stick these two together, you end up with glucose 6-phosphate. And that increases the amount of energy in that molecule by 13.8 kilojoules per mole. Cool, right? Now we have more energy. And so that means that the glucose is more reactive for other reactions. And now it's very charged and it's less likely to be able to leave the cell by accident. It won't cross the cell membrane. Now, on the other side of this, to get this phosphate molecule, we took it from ATP. So to do that, you have ATP plus water. That's a reaction that takes place. Yields ADP and that inorganic phosphate that we see here, right? And when you do that, that releases 30.5 kilojoules per mole. Okay? So now we need to combine these two reactions into one coupled reaction. ATP, I'm not worrying about the water and stuff, okay? But ATP plus glucose yields ADP and glucose 6-phosphate, right? That's basically what we've done here. We used ATP and glucose to make this, right? Now, what we do is we look at these two numbers and find the difference. And if you take 30 minus 13, basically, you find out that overall, even though this molecule has more energy than it started with, overall, when we take into account how much energy was lost from ATP to fuel this reaction, we have lost a total of delta G here of negative 16 kilojoules per mole. So we've lost more energy than we gained. Overall, this coupled reaction was endergonic, overall, this coupled reaction was exergonic. Part of it was endergonic, this glucose 6-phosphate production. But overall, we lost more energy than we gained. You'll find that in any reaction, we're going to lose energy, and a lot of energy, right? Like a car, when you run your car, we talked about how there's free energy transformation, right? When we transfer energy, when you run your car, something like 30% of the energy in your gasoline runs your car. That's the free energy in the gasoline. That's what moves your car. About 70% of the energy that you paid for in your gasoline is lost as heat. There's another figure showing the same thing in your book. It's a different reaction, but the same idea. When we're making glutamine here, glutamic acid plus ammonia yields glutamine, which has an increase in energy. That's an endergonic reaction. But of course, to do that, you need to get energy from ATP. And overall, when you look at the amount of energy lost from ATP to fuel this reaction, we can see that it actually loses a little bit of energy in the process. It's an exergonic reaction when you look at this overall. But these are examples of coupled reactions. Here's one reaction. The other one is the ATP reaction. You put those together. The ATP fuels this reaction, and so you have to take into account how much energy was lost versus how much was gained, and overall coupled reactions are always exergonic. Now, ATP, very important molecule. It comes up again and again. It does a lot of work in the body. It's going to help run transport proteins that we'll talk about later. How does that work? Well, it sticks its phosphate group onto proteins. That makes them change their shape, and it allows like doors to open in the membrane and things like that. It allows for work to take place. ATP runs motor proteins that walk and actually move, transport things throughout the cell. So ATP is used not just to fuel reactions, but to run all kinds of different things in the cell. Okay, so when we pick up in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to talk now about not ATP, but we're going to talk about enzymes and their roles in running metabolic pathways.